Hey there, welcome back. In chapter 1, we focused on two items of data visualization that are very important. We talked about eye tracking as a strategy to guide our viewer's eye to the specific point in the message that we're trying to communicate. We also talked about white space, and we said that white space helps us organize and structure our data visualization much better in a way that allows our brains to process it more quickly and more effectively. And we mentioned that white space is like those subtle pauses that we make when we speak. Well, if white space is like that, then color is like the tone of our voice. Today, we'll take a deep dive into color theory. We'll understand how color can be much better for our data visualizations, but also how it can send the opposite message of what we're trying to present. So jump over to my computer with me. We'll see some examples and then we'll do some hands-on practice on how to develop graphs and use color to more effectively communicate through our data visualization. As we mentioned, color is one of the most powerful tools that we have in data visualization. But with great power comes great responsibility. In order for us to use color effectively, we need to understand the three concepts that make up color theory. When we talk about color, we're truly talking about one of this or a combination of all of these three values. We have hue, we have saturation, and we have value. Hue refers to the specific part of the light spectrum that we're actually referring to or that we're actually mentioning. So if I pick this specific point right here in the hue spectrum, then I know that I'm picking an orange color. If I pick this point right here, I know that I'm picking a blue color. So hue refers to the point that's specific to the visible spectrum of light. Now remember, light ranges from infrared to ultraviolet, and what our eyes can see is somewhere in between those two ends. And so the hue of colors that we see is the points that we can pick within that range. Saturation refers to the intensity of that color. As you can see here, a low saturation means that the color is almost muted or can go all the way down to gray. And a high saturation means that the color is at its brightest shade. Value means the amount of light that goes into the color. So you can have very dark reds or you can have very light reds. And so when you add more value, you're going to end up with very bright pink because you're adding value to the saturation. So to use this in combination, let's say I pick this green right here. So this green, I choose then my saturation and I choose this level of saturation right here. And then let's say I pick somewhere in between here. So this will give me a green that is highly saturated, that it has a lot of color, but that is not very bright. So why is this important? Well, it's important because in data visualizations, we need to understand how to use colors to communicate our message. Now, when we look at what designers have created and is known as the color wheel, we can identify different colors in different places of the wheel. What that does is allows us to see colors that are complementary and colors that are analogous. So complementary colors refers to colors that are opposite from each other. So we have blue violets opposite from oranges. And then we have, say, pinks that are opposite from blue greens. So this matters because depending on the data that we're trying to present, we want to make sure that we're choosing the right color scheme. So let me just give you another example. If I want to present some data that is very similar and all the values are very similar, then I want to choose analogous colors. These colors right here, reds, oranges, and yellows, are analogous, and so the data seems to be somewhat similar. But let's say I'm trying to contrast something good versus something bad. In that case, then I want to choose complementary colors. One part of my visual will be blue violets and the other part will be oranges. That's why it's important to understand the color wheel and to understand the color spectrum. Now, getting to specifics regarding data. If we have some data that is continuous, let me give you an example. If we're looking at the average height of our patients, and we have 300 patients, right? We'll have some patients that are 5 feet 4 inches, and then we have some patients that are 6 feet 6 inches, right? And we have a very broad range. Many of our patients that are there in our data set will be somewhere in between. If we're looking at temperatures, if I say today was 83 degrees, but tomorrow is going to be 86 degrees, we can go back and analyze at many different times of the day and find multiple points within that range of days or temperatures. So when we're representing continuous data, we typically represent it with gradients. So gradients are shades of color that is hard to separate. We see how they progressively go from one color to the other color, and it's really hard to distinguish any break in the data. And that is why we use gradients to represent continuous data. Now let's say you go to a restaurant, right? And in that restaurant, they ask you to rate them in 1 of 4 stars. You can choose didn't like it, liked it a little, liked it, and then really loved it, right? So those are your 4 categories that you get to choose on how to rate this restaurant. Well, there's no in between. You either didn't like it, or you liked it a little, or you liked it a lot, or you loved it. One of those 4. In that case, your data will be represented with 4 different shades of color. But there's a clear distinction between each of those colors. You have to present it in a way that you can separate. Let's make that here. Each color, so you understand that there's a distinction between those colors. So that is why color theory is important in that data visualizations, because you need to understand that for continuous data, for example, you can communicate a particular message. For discrete data, you can communicate a particular message. You can also use different shades, different hues, different values, different levels of saturation to better communicate your message. Now, let's look at this example. This data comes from the same data sets that we use on the chapter 1 examples. So can I communicate this message better by using color? Right now, when I first look at this, I see a lot of colors. And I see this happening all the time. A lot of people create graphs and they choose the default color setting, and that puts all these colors on their graph. Now, the problem I have, well, let me go back to that. The problem I have with this is that it's really hard for me to know what matters most here. So if I'm looking at the health problems, well, I can see that, there's a higher incidence of skin cancer in Arizona, but I'm not really sure if that's what matters in this graph. But if I want to convey a specific message, as I mentioned in chapter 1, our visualizations have to communicate a message that is specific. So if I want to communicate a specific message, I can change this data around and I can show it, and I can choose to present it this way. Now our categories are actually the health problems. And then our bars are actually the states. And when we sort it this way, we can see that one state has a greater incidence in almost every health category, or at least 2 states dominate the graph. So in that sense, we can focus on communicating data that is relevant to the viewer. The viewer now can tell what we're referring to. And when we say Arizona and Colorado present the highest health issues in our data set, we can focus on that. Why don't we focus on this? Because for the point that we're trying to communicate, it doesn't matter. So we're showing arthritis, and we're showing that those two states have higher incidence. If we choose the other data set or the other graph, we really can't tell what really matters or what's something that it's important in this graph. But when we look at this here, now we can see I don't really care much about, this states right here, because these states right here are actually lower. So what I really need to focus on is those two. So I choose color to highlight those two. So how do I choose color? Well, first I choose a darker blue to highlight the highest values. Now I know these values are the highest. Visually I can tell that. So then I choose a darker blue. Then I choose a lighter shade of blue to highlight the next values. Why do I choose blue? Because this data right here is showing me a category. And so it's not showing me a different value on how bad or how good it is. It's just showing me a different category, a different state. And so blue is a very neutral color. It doesn't tell us that it's good or bad. Sometimes it can be used opposite to orange to indicate good or bad. But in this case, it's just very neutral, and it just tells me that we have problems, not necessarily based on the health issue, but based on those two states. I hope that's helpful. Like if you look at this data right here, I hope when you look at this, it makes more sense. Now, let's look at another example. It also comes from the same data set. Now, when we look at this example, we can see that people who never smoke are healthier. We pull this data and we have data that is somewhat irrelevant, right? We're looking at current smokers, or people that smoke every day, people that smoke some days, people that used to smoke, and then we have people that never smoked. These people, when I look at the data trend, I see a value that is increasing. Everybody else's value is decreasing. So what I want to highlight is that this group of people are healthier in value. They have better health. So while I can choose to show it this way, I can also filter that data and then choose to use it and show it this way. And now we can pull only the people that smoke every day and the people that never smoked. And then out of those people, we can show their health status and just a comparison between their poor health and the excellent health. So I will be effectively removing these categories right here, and I'll be effectively removing this right here, and then just compare this and this to this and this. By being selective, I can tell my story much better. I can actually focus on data issues or problems that I want to highlight. And then we choose colors. We choose this shade of green and this shade of red or pink, because automatically that sends a message that the important, that the good and the positive is the green. And it's very easy and very quickly I can compare the rate of health that is excellent on the people that smoke every day, and is 53.34%, against the rate of excellent health in the people that never smoked. And that's much, much bigger. It's very easy for me to make a comparison between these two. Now that we looked at this, let's actually work through these examples. Let's take a look at our data set and work through the examples. So we'll start by, just like we did before, creating a pivot table and placing it in a new worksheet. Now we said, and we'll be copying this because it's just way too many steps. We said arthritis, COPD, depressive disorder, asthma, kidney disease, and cancer. Now we have all those values there. as a category. Now we choose the state and we choose the values. So now let's select the state. And in this case, we'll move the values over here. Now we have a table for all the states right here. Actually, let me move this here so that I can filter it. Let's just pick the first 6. I select that and I can filter and then keep selected items only. And now I can actually move the state back here. Now we have a table that we can use. But remember, our data set is actually, our pivot table is actually summing all of these values. Now in this case, it matters because if we look at our data, we can see that head skin cancer has values of 0 and 1. Head asthma has values of 0 and 1. So let's make an assumption and assume that 1 means yes and 0 means no. If I choose a count of these values, then it's going to give me the total for all the values because it's just going to count all the zeros and all the ones together. So in this case, we're choosing a sum. So now let's create this graph. When we go here and go to the recommended charts, we see that it recommends this vertical chart. Now that's very similar to what we created before. So we have the health problems by state. In this case, they're not by state, they're actually by category. So we're one step ahead. But if we switch it by column here, now we can see the health problems by state. So we'll do some of the cleanup that we've done, that we've learned about before, and remove some of the extra clutter. And so, as we mentioned before, this graph is really not helpful and it doesn't communicate our message better. So what we'll do is we'll switch the rows and the columns, and that way we'll be able to switch the categories. Now when we switch these categories, we can see that there are values that are higher in different states. And typically, like normally I would see, some that are higher than anything else. We can see Arizona is higher in in all of them actually. And then we can see that Colorado is higher as well. So for us to display this better, let's rearrange that. I want to have Arizona and Colorado together. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to drag this all the way here, place Arizona in the end, and that way I have a more normal increase in value of each disease or each illness or each instance, right? So we're going to remove this axis here because we only care about the top 2. Now that we have this and we want to communicate this message, let's choose a color scheme, this color scheme, and then let's choose this one and actually format it and select the fill. Again, we'll pick a neutral color and select this one and then pick the next shade of that neutral color. And now our chart is looking more like what we ended up with in the example. So now we can highlight this. Well, we can add data labels. Now here's what another thing that's important. Our data set contains these values as numbers. We can choose to show this as percentage if we want to, but because we're actually counting the numbers of ones, which we're actually saying we're counting the number of people that had a positive diagnosis, then we can keep it as numbers. Now, if we wanted to change that and make it a percentage of the overall total, we can select we could select the data, go the value field settings and show the values as, and we can choose a percentage of the grand total. If we did that, we'll have a more accurate description of the the type of diagnosis that we're looking at. We have to looks like we have to change each one of these one at a time. Okay, so now that we have this as percentages, now we have a more accurate representation because we're actually looking at the percentage of people that showed a positive diagnosis of each one of these categories rather than the number of people. So in regards to how many people from Arizona versus how many people from Colorado, it's good to have percentages. That way we have a more accurate representation. But to stay on topic, now all we need to do here is add a chart title. This chart title can be something descriptive of what we're actually showing. And we can say Colorado and have higher rates of diagnosis or of health issues. Okay, now we can do a little bit more cleanup here. We can make this bigger and bold. We can add a label to this, and then we can copy the format of this and apply it to that. And then we'll have to work on the ones that Excel will overlap so that it's clear for the viewer. Like this one's right here, so that our viewer knows what we're actually showing. And then let's actually change this to 1 decimal number so that it's easier to see. Now, when you look at this axis labels, you can fix that very easily by just going and fixing it in your pivot chart. So let's do find and replace, and we will select sum of had and replace with nothing. And then now we have the diagnosis. Let's just fix the ones that have 2 words: skin cancer, kidney disease, and depressive disorder. And now we have a graph that makes more sense. Let's actually increase the font here, and then lastly we'll fix some of the white space. And now we have completed a graph that communicates our message much better than what Excel will give us by default. So let's look at another example. We'll pull smoker status, and then we'll pick general health and patient ID. Now we need to count the number of patient IDs. So we'll select count here, and now we can see, and now we want to sort these ones. Actually, excellent should be at the bottom here, and then poor should be at the top. And now we can see poor, fair, good, very good, and excellent. So what can we do with this graph? We also did percentages for this one. So let's do percentages here as well. Okay, so now that we switched these to percentages, we want to emphasize the good trend. So we'll pick this one, and because green communicates a better value and something positive, we'll actually fill this with green. The rest of them, we can make them gray. We don't really care about the other ones. So now that we've done that, let's select this one and make it green. Now, because this one's, all of the other ones are negative and this one is positive, we can do something else. We can select this and actually add here a trend line. And out of the trend line options, we see linear, exponential, linear forecast. All this is beyond the scope of this tutorial, but let's just pick a linear trend. So now that we have that, I'm going to remove some of these legends here. And so for example, this one, I'm going to remove that. And now we can see our linear trend, we can also make it green. That way it'll coincide with what we're actually displaying. Now we need to add a chart title. So for the chart title here, we can select people who never smoked have better health. I mean, it's very simple, but it's very straightforward, and it goes straight to the point. So this is an example of using color to highlight something. Now let's work on a little bit on our white space. Let's add here a label. Let's actually fix that label and make it better. And then if it's not easy to see, we can select it and move it somewhere where it's easier to see. Actually, let's select our data, lower this to no decimals, and now we can see a graph that by using color is representing a positive trend. Now let's look at our last example. For this last example, we're gonna do something a little bit different. So we'll pick age category. Let's pick years, and let's pick BMI. Now that we have this matrix, let's actually create our chart. Let's go here and insert and look at the recommended charts. So just for kicks, let's pick this one, and you can see how awful this is. Like, there's really nothing that we can make sense of in this graph. But let's actually go back and select a different chart type. And because we're working with time frames, the default chart for time frames is always going to be the line chart. The line chart will show us an axis here that shows time frames. That's just the way that it's easier, and that line charts can communicate better. Now, there's one thing in this chart. Let me just move this. Let's move it up to the top. There's one thing here that I have to point out. You never want to have your graphs where the scale starts at a value other than 0. And when I say never, I say that with an asterisk. If all our data, in this case, if all our data is between 25.5 and 32, then if we make this axis 0, I want you to see what happens. So the minimum will be 0, and then the maximum will be 35. Then we really can't display this data. We really can't communicate a message because everything is crammed up there. So in that sense, Excel does something for us. It automatically adjusts our graph to the values that it thinks we want to show. Now, the exception that I will make is if we want to show data that is contained within this range right here, and all our data will be contained within this range, we can make that exception and we can adjust our axis to give more clarity. But when we do that, we have to make sure that we're actually showing either the axis or that we're actually showing the labels. Now, as a general rule, you don't use this. You don't rely on charts that start at any point higher than 0. But like I said, for particular specific purposes, you can make this exception if it's going to help you illustrate your point better. But you got to make sure that you're telling your viewers that fact by showing the values here. Now, having said that, having made that very clear, so what do we do with this data? If I show this to my audience, it would be almost impossible for them to know what I'm showing here. So let's actually add a chart title here, and let's use the one that we have as a reference. People 18 to 24 have the lowest BMI over time. Actually, that's not accurate, and we'll see why very soon. So now we have an average BMI for large group of people here, and then we have two that are kind of separate. So when we click or when we hover over this one, we can see that this line right here are people 18 to 24. And then when we hover over this one, we can see that this line is people 80 years or older. Why? I don't know. But people 80 years or older and people 18 to 24, so the oldest group and the youngest group, have a lower BMI. So now that we know that, we can change the color scheme here. We can select the grays, and then we can highlight this one and format it to show a color. Again, we will pick neutral colors for this, and we can pick a different shade of blue. And now we have data that is more easily understood. Now, this is hard to read. This legend is hard to read. So what do I do? What do we do about that? Well, first of all, we can get rid of this. We don't have to have a legend when we have too many lines. And what I'll show you is what you already saw in the example. It is okay and is actually a good practice to annotate your graphs. So let's put a square here, and then we'll annotate this. Because I've already done this, I'm gonna just copy this text. Actually, I'm gonna copy this entire box. And then we'll paste it here. And then we can indicate this, that the BMI indices in our population correspond to those, the best ones correspond to those 18 to 24-year-olds and those 80 years or older. So we have made very specific here that all of these are multiple categories that we don't care about. And then these two are the ones that we care about because those are the healthiest BMI or whatever you want to show. Let's actually remove this axis and add the labels here. Add data labels, we click on them and we want to show them above, and then we'll add data labels on this one. We click on them and then we want to show this below so that we have a better idea of what we're actually looking at. Let's make this bold. Let's make this bold, a little bit bigger. And now we're seeing the average BMI. And now we can say, so we're actually showing very clear title. It tells the message immediately. We show all this and we show that this is not really something we want. And if we wanted to group that, we can also insert a shape and select this one right here, right? And that way we'll group this and then we'll change this to gray. And now, oh, actually, let's move this up a little bit. And now we have grouped this. And now we can see what we're trying to show. Let's make this a little bit better looking by increasing the width. Let's go with 3.25. Same for this. And then we can actually add markers. We'll select the marker, the built-in round one. We'll make that 8. And then we will actually choose, let's actually choose the blue. And then we'll add a marker here, same thing, built-in circle, make that 8. And then for the marker, we'll choose a fill. And for the fill, we'll choose white. And then for the fill here, in the marker fill, we'll choose white as well. And then we'll make this bigger. Do 325. We'll make this also 325. Let's actually do something else. Select this, make it a smooth line. Select this, make it a smooth line. And now you have a visual that communicates a message very effectively, that draws the viewer down to the points that we want to highlight. Notice here that we use bold text on the points that we want to highlight as well. Same thing here. So we balance the white space by placing this in a way that everything looks somewhat balanced, and then the viewer will immediately pay attention to this point in the graph. So those are some examples of how you can use color to make your emphasis on the points that you want to communicate in your data visualizations. So did you like this chapter? Color is one of my favorite topics. In the next chapter though, we will focus on do's and don'ts of selecting the right graphs. We'll look at some examples of what graphs send the right message and what graphs you should not be using and avoiding at all costs. Can't wait to see you there.